Okay, it looks like it's time to get started. Thank you everyone for joining our live lecture today. My name is Isaac and I'll be the lead instructor for the lecture. And today's topic will be Front-End Foundations Part 1. So what that means is this lecture will cover the first half of the Front-End Foundations curriculum. So if you're in that section, this is the lecture for you. A couple things to mention before we get started today. The first one being is we're going to stop periodically throughout this lecture to open the floor for questions. So if you do have questions come up along the way, we just ask that you wait until those designated times to ask them. Another thing to mention is that we are recording this lecture. So that means once we're done here, we are going to be posting it on our YouTube channel, and we're going to make that link available to you in your student dashboard. Okay, so diving right in, let's go ahead and discuss what topics we will be going over today. Okay, and today's actually going to be review. Okay, and what we're going to be reviewing today is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And by now, you should have been introduced to all of these concepts, at least at a beginner level. And so we're just going to be reviewing what you've been introduced to today. Okay, so let's start with HTML. And as we know, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And in a nutshell, it allows us to create a skeleton structure on a page, which we can then build upon. Okay, and then we've got CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And this is a language we can use to style our HTML document and give it, the colors and the font styling and all the stuff we see like on a web page like this one. Okay, and then finally we've got JavaScript, and JavaScript is the programming language which is going to allow us to add interaction. So maybe when a user clicks a button, we'll then run an event, right? And this will be what JavaScript's responsible for. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off by opening up our command line. And I'm going to change onto my desktop. I'm going to create a new directory, and I'm going to call this one Front-End Foundations. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open that up inside my text editor. Okay, so today I'm using Visual Studio for my text editor. So I'll just go ahead and open that up. Okay. And then I'll go ahead and open up Front-End Foundations. Okay. Excellent. So now let's go ahead and change directories into Front-End Foundations. And from here, we need to start off by creating a basic HTML document. Okay. And so I'm going to call mine index.html. Okay. And now within the index.html, we need to create what's called an HTML skeleton. Okay. And so how we can do this is we start with the parent HTML element. Okay, and then within that, we go ahead and pass in a head and a body, okay, very much like a regular skeleton would have, right? And so we pass in the head, we pass in a title. The title is just going to be what appears on the tab in our browser. So I'm just going to put Front-End Foundations for now. And then right below the head element, we can put a body element. And within this, we put all the content which is visible to the user. Okay, so maybe I'll just say hello world, throw in some random text here. Okay, so we save all, and now let's copy the path of our index, and let's paste it on in our browser here. Okay, and as you can see, it's rendering, the text that we put between the body element. Okay, so now we've got our basic HTML doc up and running. Let's go ahead and let's explore some common body elements which are visible to the user, okay? So let's say we're writing an article, okay? And so first thing we want to do is put, a title for an article, okay? So to do this, we could use what's called a header element, okay? And header elements are H1 through H6, okay? So we could say H1, but you could also say H6, right? And basically how it works is H1 by default is the biggest size, and then it just gets smaller from there. And so let's see how that looks. So for the title of my article, I'm going to put how to become a programmer. Okay, so from here we can save all. and we can refresh our browser. We can see that unlike the text we saw before, this actually is much bigger and much more emphasized, right? And so it's much more appropriate for something like an article title. Okay, so now we need to put some article text. Okay, and this is where another common body element comes into play called a paragraph element. Okay, and so how we can do this is we simply use a P and then we pass in the text. Okay, so I'm just going to use some placeholder text for now to kind of see what it would look like. Okay, so let's save all, and we refresh, and we can see that, you know, now we have a little paragraph about how to become a programmer. Okay, so now let's say we want to list what different technologies the person's gonna have to learn to become a programmer. Okay, so this is where something like a list element would come into play, and we actually have a couple different options for list elements. We have what's called an unordered list, and an unordered list is simply bullet points next to each list item, or we have an ordered list, which is going to be numerical values next to each item. Okay, so let's start by exploring what an unordered list would look like. Okay, so an unordered list, we use these UL tags here. And we pass in list item elements. Okay, so maybe the three technologies we need to learn are HTML. Okay, and then we'll do CSS, and then we'll do JS. Okay, so from here, let's save all, refresh our browser. We can see now we got this nice little list with bullet points, right, kind of indented, all set up for us. Okay, and so from here, if we want to make an ordered list, we could simply change this from unordered list to ordered list. Okay. And as you see, I just leave the children element the same, and the only thing I'm really changing here is that parent element. Okay, so from here, we can go ahead and save all, and we can refresh, and we see that it changes from a simple bullet point to numerical value. So I'm sure by now, you're familiar with this kind of, markup because you've seen it in things like, Word document editors, and so it's very commonplace to see in articles and things of that nature. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and let's say at the end of our article here, we want to have like a contact us form so people can contact us and ask us questions about the article. So that's where another common element comes into play, is a form element. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put an H3, and I'm going to say contact us. And then from here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a form element. And within this form element, I'm going to nest some buttons and some inputs. So I'll start with the input. It'll be a type of text. And we'll do a placeholder equal to the email of the person who wants to contact us. Okay. And then we could go ahead and we could put a button in. And this button could just say submit. Okay. And then from here, we can save all, and we can refresh. Okay, and you can see now we have a nice little contact us form, right, with an input and a button for submitting information. Okay. And so next, let's say we want to have an about the author link, right, which will link them to a page which will, have a short little summary about the author. Okay, and so anytime we want to navigate to different web pages, we're going to use what's called an anchor element to accomplish this. Okay, and so let's go ahead and let's first start off by setting up our about HTML. Okay, so I'm just going to do that right in the root directory. We'll call it about HTML, and we'll go ahead and we'll start off by giving an HTML parent element, then we'll give it a head, and we'll give it a title, and we'll say about for the title, and then below the title, we'll go, or below the head, we'll put the body element. Inside the body, let's just go and put H1, and we'll say about the author, and then we'll put paragraph tag down here with some placeholder text. Okay, so let's go ahead and just copy that, and we'll go ahead and place that in. Okay, so now we can save all, and in our index here, we can go ahead and we can put an anchor element, which is just this A here. And an anchor element's going to have an attribute, which is called href. And this is going to allow us to reference a web page. Whenever this is clicked on, it will navigate to that web page. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say about the author for the title of the link. Okay, and then we'll say about .html for the actual reference. Okay, so from here, let's save all. And let's refresh. Okay, and let's click on about the author. And as you can see, it references this web page and navigates us to that. Okay, but just like we can navigate between our own internal web pages, we can also navigate to third-party links as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, let's say, CSS link right here. Okay, and let's say, you know, we want to provide a link so they can learn about CSS. Okay, so we could do another anchor element, except this time for the reference, I'm going to put in this third-party link instead of my own. Okay, and then I'm going to say learn about CSS. Okay, so from here we can save all, and we can refresh our browser. And when we click on learn about CSS, we can see that it redirects us to this third-party website. Okay. All right, so that's a pretty good recap on HTML. So let's go ahead and let's move on to CSS. Okay, so CSS, as we talked about, is going to be responsible for the cosmetics of a web page, right? The colors and the fonts and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and first erase our form here. Okay, inside our index, we'll just erase pretty much everything inside the body. Okay, and then let's go ahead and let's, in our root directory, let's create a style sheet called style CSS. Oops. Okay, and within within our index document here, we're going to reference this style sheet. So whenever this is loaded in, this also loads in. Okay, so to do this, we can put a link, and we can put the reference to styles.css. Okay, so now if we save all, go back to our browser and inspect the network here, we can see that it's loading in our style sheet as well as our HTML doc. Okay, so now we know that's loading in successfully. Let's go ahead and talk about how CSS works. Okay, and CSS works in a series of selectors. And selectors is a way of targeting specific elements and applying a style to them. Okay, and so there's different selectors we can use. So the first one we're going to talk about is an ID selector. An ID selector is when we just want to style one individual element. Okay, so let's say we have an H1, and we'll just say hello world, and let's say we want to style this the color red. So to do this, we first need to give it an ID, and we'll just call this ID greeting. And that way, I have a way to target this element, okay? And so within my style sheet here, to target and set up an ID selector, we simply reference the hashtag, and then the name of the ID, which we called greeting. Okay, then we put a pair of curly brackets, and we pass in a key value pair of styles. So in our example, we want a color equal to red. Okay, so from here, it's going to find all elements with an ID of greeting, which there will only be one, and it's going to style that. Okay, so let's save all, and we refresh our browser. We can see that we get the same, header, but this time it is colored according to our style sheet. Okay, and this is again what's called an ID selector. Now, there might be times where, for example, we have hello world, and then goodbye, right? And so if we had this, for example, we couldn't just use ID, or the greeting ID for this as well, right? We would have to say something like greeting 1, greeting 2, but then in our style sheet, we would just be repeating the same style, just different names for selectors. So to avoid that, we can use the element type as a selector. Okay, so if they're the same element type, what we can do is, instead of giving anything an ID, we just target it by its element type, which, as you can see, is H1. So I'm going to say H1 color red. From here, we save all, and we refresh, and we can see that it targets both of them by their element type and then applies the style we see here in our style sheet. Okay, so now comes the question, well, what happens if we have a group of elements with different types? Okay, so let's say we have an H1, H2, and let's say an H3. Okay. Okay, so now to style all three of these, we couldn't use an ID, otherwise we're going to be repeating ourselves. We can't use an element selector. So instead, we use something called a class selector. And a class selector is a way of selecting a group of elements and targeting them by a class instead of, worrying about an element type. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a class on the first one and make it equal to color red. Okay, then I'm going to take that same class and apply it to the H2 and the H3. Okay, so now that that's complete, we can go ahead and head to our style sheet. And how you reference a class is you put a dot and then the name of the class. And then it's business as usual. We just pass in key value pair styles, which this time we'll say color is red. Okay, so from here, we can save all, and we can refresh our browser. We can see that regardless of the element type, it targets all of them by their class and blankets them under this one style. Okay, and that is how we can set up different static selectors in CSS. Now, there are ways that we can set up selectors that only are applied when certain browser events are happening, okay? And these are referred to as pseudo selectors. So let's explore one of these, okay? So for example, we'll get rid of all of our current markup, and we'll just put a simple greeting here. Oops. Okay, and from here in our style sheet, we can reference that greeting, and we can apply a pseudo selector to where it will only apply a specific style if the element is hovered over. Okay, so let's do that, for example. So we'll go ahead and reference greeting, and then we will put colon hover. Okay, and then I pass in my key value pair of styles. So now it's only going to apply these styles if this event is happening, the hover event. Okay, so to test this out, let's save all, and let's refresh our browser. And as you can see, only when we hover over this is it applying that style now, whereas before it was static, right? So depending on your specific design, you might want a pseudo selector to bring more attention to specific elements on your page. But be aware that there are many other kinds, right? Hover is just one, but there are several other pseudo selectors you can use to activate styles during specific browser events. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and talk about nested selectors. Okay, so with CSS, we work under the rule the styles that are applied to the parent are also applied to the children, okay? But sometimes we're gonna want to apply styles to children elements and not to the parent at all. And to do this, we have to use what's called this nested selector. So let's say, for example, we have a form, and inside this form, we're going to have a simple input, and then as well, we'll go ahead and we'll have a button, okay? And let's say the idea here is we want to style the input and the button, but we don't want to style the parent element, the form. So how we can do this is we go to our style sheet, and first we would reference the parent element, and then we'd reference the child. Okay, so as you can see, I'm referencing the form's input by just putting a space, and then I can pass in the style. So maybe I'll just give it a background color equal to yellow. Okay. And so now I can do the same thing for the button, right? So I can say form button, and maybe we'll just change the color of the button to red. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh, and we can see that we're applying styles to the children elements, but we are not applying them to the parent, right? And that's because we are using these nested selectors here. All right, moving right along, I think we've covered selectors pretty good here. Let's talk about the CSS box model. Okay, so every element you create in the browser, you can imagine has an invisible box around it, okay? And the box is made up of 3 different layers. You've got what's called the padding. This is the spacing inside the box. Then you've got what's called the margin. The border, which is the spacing between the inside and the outside of the box. Then you've got the margin, which is the spacing on the outside of the box. So let's go ahead and let's set up a simple greeting element here. And let's apply those 3 different aspects of the box model to this element to see them in a little more robust fashion. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll give this an ID equal to greeting. And then in our style sheet here, we will target greeting. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and start with the padding. And padding works on 4 different sides, right? Like I said, it's an invisible box. It's not a circle, not a triangle, it's a box, okay? So because boxes have 4 sides, we have to apply the padding to 4 sides, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna give it 10 pixels on each side, okay? And then from here, we have to give it the middle layer, the border, okay? So the border, first we have to specify a thickness of the border, then we have to specify the pattern, which I'll just make a solid line, and then we have to specify the color, which I'll make black. So from here, we can go ahead and add a margin, which if you remember is the spacing on the outside of the box. So I can go ahead and I'm just gonna apply a little more for that. So let's do 50 pixels. Okay, so now we can see this all in action by saving all, and we refresh our browser. We can see that the element is pushed away, right, from the top and the left and the right, right? So there's obviously something here. And how we can actually see this in real time is we can simply click inspect on the element itself, and you'll notice that the 3 different layers of the box model are lighting up. Okay, so if we reference here, we've got the padding, which is the space on the inside of the box, and we got the border, which is the space between the inside and outside, and finally we have the margin. And as you can see, by using these, we can move our elements around and position them in an appealing way instead of just having them all float to the top left corner every time. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and let's talk about font family or web fonts. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll get rid of the ID there, and let's say that we want to apply a different browser font than what we see here. Okay, so our first approach is we could use a built-in browser font, and how we could do this is we'll target everything within the body, and we'll say the font family is equal to one of these built-in fonts. And I'm just going to use monospace for now, just so we can see in action. So we save all, and from here we can go ahead and we refresh. We can see that it's changed that font to this more like typewriter-looking font, right? And so, although that is useful and you can use that if it works, these built-in browser fonts are a little limited. And so a lot of developers tend to go with custom fonts, okay? There's a lot of custom font providers, but definitely the most used is called Google Fonts, okay? So let's go ahead and let's go to Google, and let's go to Google Fonts. And from here, we can go ahead and explore all the different fonts they have. Okay, so let's say we like this one. So we can go ahead and we can select that. And from here, we're just gonna use the standard embed method. So I'm gonna copy the font, and I'm gonna come in my index here, and I'm going to reference it right above my custom style sheet, okay? And that way, if I am referencing the font in here, it'll already be loaded in. Okay, so next, it lets us know this is how we can use the font. Okay, we just have to specify this specific font family. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna pass in that font family, but as well, you'll notice we have a comma and another font listed, right? And this is the backup font, right? This is the built-in browser font that will run in the event that this one fails to load. Okay, so now we can see this in action by refreshing all. And let's go ahead and refresh our browser. And as we can see, it's applying the same font style as we see here, right? Same style, okay? And not that complicated either, right? Just a matter of picking which one you want and linking it up here. Okay, so let's wrap up CSS with the topic of media queries. Okay, so media queries are ways that we can define styles based on logistical expressions evaluating true or false. Okay, and more commonly than not, this media query is used to watch the width of the screen. And when the width gets to a certain point, then a new style is applied. Okay, so let's go ahead and go with that same scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and give my greeting here an ID. Okay, and the idea is whenever our screen width is a minimum of 800, we'll apply a specific style. Okay, so in our style sheet here, how we can set up a media query is we use the @media rule, and then we say min width is going to be equal to 800 pixels. Okay, and if it is equal to 800 pixels, then we are going to target the greeting element, and the greeting element is going to be styled different font size. Okay, so let's just say font size, and let's go ahead and say 50 pixels. Okay, and then when it is, not a minimum of 800, it will not apply the style. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's save all and refresh our browser. Okay, and as you can see that when it's a min of 800, it applies a style. And then when we go below 800, right, because it's not true, it no longer applies that style. Okay, and this is how we can get really nice and responsive websites, right? They adapt basically to the device size. Okay, so we're not just stuck with, measuring width. We can do other things, right? I could even switch this around to max width if I wanted, right? So now it'll flip-flop to where it will only apply that style if we're below 800 instead of above, right? So as we can see, now it applies it when it goes below, okay? So from here, we can, basically just go down our page and make elements grow, shrink, disappear, really do whatever we need to adapt to that new device size. Okay, so pretty good review so far of HTML and CSS. So let's go ahead and open up the floor and let's see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so floor is open. If you have questions, feel free to ask them now. Okay, doesn't appear anyone has any questions yet, so let's go ahead and keep moving forward. So next, let's review JavaScript, okay? And like we talked about, JavaScript's going to be responsible for the interactions in our program, such as button click events, and that kind of thing. So let's go ahead and let's start off by bringing in a JavaScript file we can write in, okay? So let's go to our root directory, and we will create an app.js file. Okay, and then right at the bottom of the body here, I'm gonna have a little section for my app scripts. And I'm going to have a script with a source pointing to app.js. And that's how I'm gonna load it in. So if we save all and we go to the network, we can refresh and we can see that it's loading in our script file as well as our, our document and our style sheet. Okay, so everything's loading in, all nice and easy. So next, we can go and head to our app.js. We can start off by talking about JavaScript variables. Okay, and in a nutshell, JavaScript variables are simply storage containers for browser-side data. Okay, and so the thing about these variables, though, is there's more than one way to create them, okay? Because we're going to have different situations where we want them to behave differently, okay? So the first and most traditional approach to creating JavaScript variables is using the var keyword, okay? So I could do something like this. I could say var, and then we declare the name of the variable, which is normally intuitive to what data it's storing. So let's just say I want to store my name, like some raw text with my name. So you'll notice I declared it using camel case, okay? And by convention, you always use camel case with JavaScript variables, okay? And then we'll use this assignment operator to assign the value on the left to this variable, okay? Or the value on the right, I'm sorry. So the value here, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm going to make what's called a string data type. And that's just some raw text between a pair of quotes, okay? So I'll go ahead and put my name between there. And then I can use a tool called console log to see the value of this variable when the browser runs, okay? So we can save all, and we can refresh. Well, there we go. We can see that it evaluates Isaac, right? And so as you can see, it's basically letting us know how the browser is interpreting that variable, okay? And so just like using the var keyword, we can also use another keyword to create a variable called let, okay? And the main difference between let and var really comes in how they behave within functions. How we assign variables is very much the same, okay? So let's go ahead and save all. And if we were to refresh, we can see it gives us the same exact result, right? So again, we can use them, you know, pretty much the same as far as assigning. It's just within functions, they do act differently, which we'll get into here in a bit. But for now, know that let is kind of like the new improved version of var, okay? And so now let's explore the dynamic nature of these variables, okay? So when I say dynamic, that means something has the ability to be changed after creation. So if I wanted to change my name to Joe, I would just have to do this. And because the script is read from top to bottom, and the last value my name was assigned in memory was Joe, that's what will be printed out. Okay, so we can save all, and we can refresh. We can see that it prints out Joe, not Isaac. Okay, and so just like we can, you know, reassign them, there might be times where we want these variables to be static in value, right? We don't want them to be able to change. Something like a company name, for instance. You know that a company name should pretty much always stay the same on the website, right? We never want to overwrite that. So to do this, instead of using a dynamic variable, we could use a constant, okay? And so to create a constant, we use the const keyword, and then I'll just use declare the name of the variable, which I'll call company name. We'll just call this Isaac's company. Okay, and from here, we can go ahead and we can say company name equals other company. And now our browser is going to throw an error because we're trying to reassign the value of a constant, and that's not allowed. And that's good, right? We don't want this to be able to, you know, be overwritten. Okay, and as you can see, we get the error as expected. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's talk about some other JavaScript data types. Okay, so we already talked about how we can you know, use a string for, you know, just some text between a pair of quotes. Now let's go ahead and explore a number data type. Okay, and where numbers are useful is we can actually perform mathematical operations with them. Okay, so for example, if I had a variable represent my age, I could say 99, and then I could have a variable represent next year's age. And because the value of my age is a number, I can say my age plus 1. And then I can console log the value of next year's age. Okay, so I'll say next year's age. So we save all, and we refresh. We can see that it calculates that result and prints it out for us. Okay, and we're not just limited to, you know, simple addition. We could do subtraction, multiplication, division, right? Really depending on what we need. It just has to be a number data type to be able to perform it. And that's really, you know, only limitation. Okay, so another common data type we'll talk about is a Boolean, okay? And so in JavaScript, a Boolean is simply a true or false value. So for example, I could create a variable and I could call it concode, and we'll go ahead and pass in true for that, okay? And we'll console log the result of concode. So we'll save all, and we will refresh. As you can see, it evaluates true. And all I did was pass in the, the English word true without a pair of quotes, right? And that's how the browser knows to interpret it as a Boolean. Okay, so just like, I can set it up true, I can also do false. So let's say advance, and I can just pass in false for that. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh, and you can see that we have that only other value, false. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, well, how is this, useful? And really, it goes back to the very, fiber of how computers think in ones and zeros. Okay, and ones and zeros simply break down to true or false. Okay, and so same way that that helps the computer to make decisions. The Booleans help our browser program to make decisions as well. For example, if this condition is true, run this block of code. Otherwise, run this block of code, right? So that's where you'll see these Booleans come into play. Okay. So next, let's go ahead and let's talk about another data type called an object. Okay. So an object in JavaScript is a single variable entity which represents many key value pairs. Okay. And so to explore this, let's explore why we need an object. Okay. So if we didn't have objects, we would simply need to create everything in single variable value entities like the following. So we had a program with users, we would say user1 name equals Joe. And then if we had another user, we'd have to say user2 name equals Jane. And then if we had different information about those users, we would have to create completely different variables to represent each user. Okay? And as you can see, just with a couple users, this is getting out of hand really quickly. Okay, and so what we can use instead is a JavaScript variable to encapsulate these information into single variable values. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called person1, or let's call it user1 actually. Okay, and user1 will have a name. Okay, and they'll have a value for that name. Okay, so from here I can separate this key value pair and I can pass in another key value pair if I want. Okay, so maybe I want age with a value of 99. So as you can see, I'm only ever declaring one variable, but inside this variable I have several key value pairs, right? And these are almost like mini variables in themselves, right? So we can go ahead and do the same thing for user2. So we'll have a name, and we'll have an age. Okay, so now let's console log the value of one of these users. Let's just start with user1. So we save all, and we refresh, and we see that we have a name and an age, right? Just like we have coded here. So now comes the question, well, how do we access the values off of this object, okay? And there's one of two approaches. We can use dot notation or bracket notation. So dot notation works fairly simply, and this is the most common approach. We simply reference the name of the object, and when we say dot, and then we reference the specific property in which we want the age for, or I'm sorry, which we want the value for. Okay, so in this case, we'll say user1.name, and it's going to return the value of that particular object property. Okay, so we refresh, and we can see now instead of returning the entire object, it's only returning Joe. Okay, and so in the same way that we use dot notation, we can use bracket notation to access values as well. Okay, so instead of a dot, we use a pair of square brackets, and then we simply reference the name of the value we want. Okay, so let's say it's user2 age. So we save all, and we see that it's 100 here, and if we refresh, we can see it's 100 in our console. Okay, and this is, again, what's called a JavaScript object, okay? So another kind of object is called an array, okay? And an array works slightly differently in the way that instead of using these custom key value pairs, we pass in single values, and it just uses index positioning to keep track of each one. Okay, so to explore this, let's go ahead and create a variable called friends, which will be equal to an array. An array is just these square brackets here, and then we pass in single values. So maybe I just have names of my friends. Okay, so I'll have Jim, Jane, Joe, and Janet. Okay, so I have my friends. So let's go ahead and use console log to see this in our browser. So we save all and we refresh. We can see that it's printing out just what we have in our code. You notice when we break it open here, we've got a special number next to each one, okay? And that's referenced as its index position. Okay, so that's how we're going to be able to access the values from this array. Just like, you know, we're able to access values from our object, we also can do the same thing with our array. Okay, so if I want to access the value of Jim, well, I need to access friends at the index of 0 because we can see Jim is at that position. So how I do that is using bracket notation. So I say friends, index of 0. Okay, we'll save all and we refresh. You can see that it gives us just Jim back now instead of the entire array, right? We can do the same thing for maybe Janet if we want, right? She's at index of 3, so we'll just say friends at the index of 3. And we refresh, and as you can see, we are getting Janet printed out, no problems. Alrighty, so moving along from JavaScript data types, let's talk about JavaScript conditionals. Okay, conditionals are ways of giving the program instructions based on logistical expression outcomes. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is let's start with the most common kind of conditional in JavaScript, which is called an if statement. Okay, so how we create an if statement, we use the if keyword, and then we pass in an expression. And this expression just has to evaluate to true or false. So I'm going to say 10 is greater than 5, which we all know is true. Okay, that's more true than it is false. Okay, so what that means, if it is true, it's going to run this block of code. Okay, so we'll go ahead and console log 10 is greater than 5. Okay, so from here we can save all. And when we refresh our browser, we can see that it runs 10 is less or greater than 5, right? And no surprises there because, you know, this is a true expression, so it should run this, okay? But in the event that we pass an expression that is false, maybe 10 is greater than 50, well, now it's going to ignore this block of code because if it evaluates to false, it just doesn't run that line, okay? So let's save all, and we refresh. We can see that we just don't get any console log now. Okay, and so what we can do is we can set up an else condition, which will run in the event that the if statement fails. Okay, so I'll console log. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh. We can see that it evaluates the first if statement, that evaluates the false. So it then runs our else statement. Okay, and as you can see, this is kind of like a backup in case this fails. Okay, and now if we want to add more expressions than just this one, right? Maybe there are several different things we're weighing in against. We can use an if else statement, or else if. Okay, so we can say else if. We can pass in another expression. So I'll say if 4 is greater than 3. Then console log 4 is greater than 3. Okay, and then we'll finally have an else statement in the event that, you know, one of those fail. So I will say none of the above. Okay, so let's save all and refresh. And as you can see, it runs 4 is greater than 3. And that's because it evaluates this first expression. This is false, so it skips this block of code and it evaluates this second expression. This is true, so it runs this block of code and ignores this block of code, this else, okay? And so as you can see, with an else if, we can just add as many other else if as we wanted, and we can continue just evaluate expression after expression until one is true. And in the event that no expression is true, we have an else statement that at the bottom here, which will run, and so we'll always have a kind of operation to fall back on. Okay, so let's save all, and let's try to run it now that all these are false. Okay, so as you can see, it goes through each expression, can't find any that's true, so it will run the else statement. Okay, and yeah, those are once again referred to as JavaScript conditionals. Next, let's talk about JavaScript loops. Okay, so oftentimes on the client side, we're going to be dealing with large collections of data, usually from a database or somewhere else, and we don't know the length of it. Okay, and the problem with that is if you don't know the length of the data, that means you don't know the index position of the data, which means you can't access just that piece of data if you need to. So what we can do instead is we can use a loop to dynamically iterate through these collections and perform these functions as we need. Okay, so to create a for loop, we start by creating a collection. Let's just say we have a collection of friends, and we want to greet all of our friends. Okay, but we don't know how many friends we have. Let's just throw in a bunch here. Okay, so we got unknown quantity of friends here. We want to greet each of them. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's set up a for loop. Okay, and the for loop takes in 3 different arguments. Where the loop starts, so I'm going to say let I equal 0. So I'll start at the index of 0, which is Joe. And then we have to tell the loop when to stop. So I'll tell the loop to keep going as long as I is less than friends.length. And then we have to tell the loop how much to increment I by each loop, which in our case, I'm going to increment it 1 integer each loop. Okay, so for the first loop, I equals 0. So I can console log hello plus friends at the index of I. And again, because I is 0 on the first loop, it's going to say hello, Joe. Then it'll go to the next loop, I will be 1. Friends at the index of 1 will be Jerry. It'll say hello, Jerry, and it'll keep going until I is no longer less than friends.length, at which time it'll exit the loop. Okay, so to see this in action, let's save all, and let's refresh our browser. As you can see, it's saying hello to all of our friends, right? We didn't have to reference any of those index positions. It just did it dynamically through the loop. Okay, and just to show that, it'll just adapt to how many ever friends we have. Let's go ahead and erase a couple of these, right? Let's say we get a new collection and it's a little shorter. So we save all, and we refresh. We can see that it just always adapts to the actual length of the array by using, this statement, okay? So moving on from loops, let's go ahead and let's talk about JavaScript functions. Okay, so functions in JavaScript are executable, repeatable blocks of code. Okay, and so there's a couple different ways we can create functions, and that is a function statement and a function expression. So let's start off by learning about how we can create a function statement. So I'm just going to start by using the function keyword, and then I will declare the name of the function, which is normally intuitive to what the function does. So I'll just say greeting, or let's say greet. It's more of an action verb, okay? And then from here, we can go ahead and we can, throw in a simple console log, okay? So let's say console.log, okay? And then to greet a specific person, we can pass in an argument, okay? And so when we invoke this function, we pass in the argument maybe of Joe, and then we populate the parameter field here, just representational value for the argument. And then we can console log hello plus n, which stands for name. Okay, so now we can save all, and if we refresh, we can see it's saying hello Joe. And again, that's a function statement. Now, function expression is very much if we were just to create a variable called greet, which was equal to a function. Okay, and so now if we save all, we can see that it behaves the exact same way as our function statement, right? So you might be asking yourself, well, what's the big difference between a function statement and a function expression then? Okay, and it really boils down to two, kind of preliminary things. The first one being is because the function expression is technically a variable, we have the ability to pass this into other functions as argument in callback situations. However, because it's a variable, we can only invoke it below the declaration. Okay, so if I was to take the greet invocation and move it above the declaration, well, now my browser is going to get an error because it won't have had time to load in greet before I try to invoke it. So it's going to say it's not defined. So if we refresh, we can see that we get that greet is not defined error. However, if we turn this back into a function statement, we can actually invoke that above or below, and it doesn't matter because it's not a variable, it'll just look through your code until it finds the function with that name. So let's save all, and we refresh. We can see that we're getting that nice function execution now. Okay. So next, let's talk about an object method. Okay. So an object method is a kind of function that is stored as a value of a property in an object. Okay. And so to explore this, let's start by creating a person variable equal to an object. Okay, and then instead of just hard coding a name like this, we can actually pass in a function, and this function will return the value of the name. Okay, so let's just say Joe for now. Okay, and now what I could do is I could run a console log, and I could say hello, and then I could say plus person.name invoke. Because that returns a string, it'll concatenate and display that accordingly. Okay, so let's save all, and let's refresh. And as you can see, we're getting that same exact result here. Right? There we go. Okay, and again, this is what we call an object method. Okay, even though it looks like it's a function, technically it's a function inside of an object, which does behave much differently than a function on its own. Next, let's go ahead and talk about scope. Okay, and scope references the accessibility of variables within a function. Okay, and so first kind of scope we're going to be talking about is global scope. Global scope simply means when we declare a function, or I'm sorry, declare a variable outside of the scope of any functions or anything to that nature. Okay, so I'm just going to put at the very top here, I'm going to call it counter and make it equal to 0. Next, I'm going to create a function statement. I'm going to call this increment. And within this function statement, I'm going to take the value of counter, and I'm going to increase it by 1. And then I'm going to console log the value of counter. And because it's in global scope, it's actually going to load in at the value of 0. So we'll be able to console log it outside the function. And then when the function runs, it's going to add 1 to 0, which will console log to 1. And then each subsequent time that increment is ran, it'll keep adding to counter in memory. So let's go ahead and set up a button. And we'll have an on-click event linked to this button for the increment function. Okay, and now every time this button's clicked, it will run this increment function, which we will then see a new value printed out. Okay, so we refresh, we can see that starting off, it immediately prints out the value of counter, which is 0. And then when I click on the button, we can see that it adds 1 to counter in memory, And then each time I click on after that, it just keeps adding 1 to this, original loaded in value. Okay. And so this again is what's referred to as our global scope. Now, if we were to take this variable and we were to move it inside of the scope of this function, well, now that's referred to as function scope. What that means is this variable is no longer existent outside of this function. So if I try to run this console log, it's actually going to give me an error now because counter is only defined within the scope of that function. So if we refresh, we can see that we get that error, right? Counter is not defined. So now another thing is each time we click the increment button, it's going to reset to 0 and then add 1. So in a nutshell, we're never actually going to see a console log reach past 1. So we refresh, and we can see that no matter how many times we click it, it's always going to stay at 1 now because the variable is declared within the function and not outside of it. Okay? And so the last kind of scope we'll talk about is block scope. Okay, and block scope is very much the difference between the var and let keywords. Okay, because the var keyword does not use block scope and let keyword does. So to explore this, let's create a function called scope test. And we'll start by using the var keyword, and we'll declare a variable x equal to 4. Then we'll have a conditional which we'll force to run. Within the block of this function, we'll go ahead and we'll console log, or I'm sorry, we'll declare the variable x equal to 1. We'll console log value of x within the scope of this function. And then within the scope of this function, we'll console log value of x. Okay, and because var does not use block scope, what that means is because x was declared as 1, as the last thing in memory, it's going to overwrite this x here, and so they're all going to equal 1, which is bad. We don't want our scopes overriding each other, but that is a side effect of using var. Okay, so we refresh, and from here we just need to invoke our function. So we'll say scope test invoke and execute. So in our browser, we can see that it's loading in 1 and 1. So if we were to take the var keyword and we were to switch it to let, well, now it's going to use block scope. And with block scope, that means, once you declare a variable within a specific scope, you cannot change it, okay? And so, therefore, x will remain 4 and 1, and instead of, the 1 and 1 we saw. Okay, so we refresh, we can see now we're getting 4 and 1, just like we wanted. Okay, and once again, that's referred to as block scope. So let's go and open up the floor one more time and see if anyone has any last questions today. Okay, so the floor is open. If you have questions, feel free to ask those now.
So this is going back to the beginning. Could you go over root directories really slowly again?
Oh, okay. Root directories. Root directory is simply like what I have here, like front-end foundations, as we can see here. This is just the parent folder, basically. Parent folder, root directory, that's the same thing. Just the folder that contains all your source code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you were going into your terminal, right?
Yeah, I was creating them in my terminal. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Which you don't have to. You can come over here and, as you can see, you can create new files here manually if you want, which a lot of students tend to do this. But if you want, you can create them here in your command line. It's just depending on your operating system. I know some of the commands are slightly different, so you might have to Google depending if you have a Mac or a Linux or Windows, right? Any other questions besides this?
No, I'm going to have to watch this over again. It was really great until we got to the last part you did with all the scopes.
Yeah.
So I'll just watch it over again and work through that. But it makes sense what you're doing, and it's good to see you using console log and stuff like that and how to use it. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, and keeping there, with the scopes. It's definitely not something you can hear once and understand. It does take a minute because it is odd. JavaScript does treat variable scope odd, but there is a method to the madness. So yeah, just rewatch as needed, and then reach out to myself and your mentors to follow up with any questions at later times.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a great rest of your day, and happy coding out there.